Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the first of 3 nights on the Scots who built America, the clans and the crossing. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Before we begin, hold a quiet image. 2 places, the same hour of day. On one side of an ocean, a Highland glen at dusk, the heather going grey in the fading light, a burn running somewhere below, finding its way between stones. The hills are old here, older than any name given to them. The light comes off them slowly in the evening, the way it does in high places, as though the ridges are reluctant to give the day back. A low stone house, peat smoke rising very straight into still air. On the other side of that same ocean, an Appalachian hollow at dusk, wood smoke rising from a cabin set back among the trees, the last light sitting on a ridge that runs north to south, holding the color longer than the valley below it. Mist gathering in the fold where 2 slopes meet, the same mist that gathers everywhere that hills and evening find each other. A creek running below the cabin. You can hear it if you are quiet. You are quiet. You are between them. The same sky, a different continent. The same unhurried settling of the world into night. The same slow exchange of warmth for dark. The same quality of stillness that falls when the wind drops and everything that was busy stops being busy. This is where tonight's story lives, in the space between those 2 dusks, in the thread, long and faint in places but never quite broken, that runs from one valley to the other across 3,000 miles of open water and 300 years of time. There is no hurry, the story is patient. It has waited this long. Let the day go, settle in, we will move slowly. Chapter 1. A small nation, a huge legacy. Scotland is a small country. It fits comfortably within the boundaries of a single large American state. It has always had a modest population. At most points in its history, fewer people lived there than live today in one large American city. And yet the mark it left on America is extraordinary in its breadth, not just in the ways that are obvious, the surnames, the place names, the Presbyterian churches. The Highland Games still held every summer from Vermont to Oregon, in deeper ways than those. The records suggest that somewhere between 40 and 50 million Americans carry some degree of Scottish or Scots-Irish ancestry. That figure is difficult to hold in the mind. It is nearly 10 times the current population of Scotland itself. Set it alongside the size of the country it came from. Set it alongside the fact that Scotland had, for much of its history, a population of only a few 100,000 souls. The mathematics of it are startling. A small nation produced a very large inheritance. How does this happen? Not through one crossing, one generation, one moment of decision. The answer is layers. Wave upon wave, across 3 centuries, people left Scotland and its extensions for America, and each wave was different from the one before. The first wave was merchants and ministers, crossing in the colonial period with ledgers and libraries, building quietly into the fabric of towns that were still finding their shape. Then the Highland soldiers, some of them planted deliberately in the colonies by a crown that wanted loyal bodies on the frontier. Then the Ulster Scots, the largest single stream, coming in their tens of thousands through Philadelphia and down through the mountain valleys, Presbyterian families who had already crossed one water and knew what leaving meant. Their crossing we will follow tonight. Then the clearance emigrants, the families pushed from Highland land they had worked for generations, arriving in the 1800s bewildered by the distance between what they had been promised and what they found. Then the economic emigrants of the late Victorian period, skilled and purposeful, Carnegie among them. Each wave carried something different. The merchants carried commerce and argument. The ministers carried literacy and governance. The Ulster Scots carried stubbornness and an intimate knowledge of hardship. The clearance emigrants carried grief and also a quality of endurance that the grief had not managed to extinguish. The surnames are a thread you can follow. MacDonald, Campbell, Stewart, Graham, Henderson, Ferguson, Armstrong, Douglas, Ross, Murray. If you carry one of those names or a spelling variant of one, the probability is high that somewhere in your family's past, someone stood on a hillside in Scotland and watched a familiar world become the past. But surnames are only the surface layer. The deeper trace is in the land itself, in the names on the map, the Columbias and the Aberdeens and the Prestons that Scottish settlers pressed onto a country that already had its own names, already had its own peoples, and its own deep past. That is something to hold honestly as we go through these nights. The land that Scottish settlers moved into was not empty. It had been home to the Cherokee and the Lenape and the Haudenosaunee and dozens of other peoples for thousands of years. Their presence shaped everything: the paths through the mountains, the knowledge of where things grew, the terms on which settlement was even possible. The frontier story is complex and often painful from that angle. Scottish settlers were part of the larger movement of European colonization, and the land they cleared and built on had been lost by others. That truth does not undo what the Scots built. It sits alongside it, as history requires. The place names tell both stories at once. Shenandoah is not a Scottish word. Cumberland Gap was named by English surveyors, but the gap itself had been known to Cherokee hunters and traders long before any European walked through it. The names layer on top of each other, and underneath them all the land simply continues, patient, and older than any of them. The deeper Scottish trace is also in the music, in the way certain tunes came down through Appalachian hollows and became something new without forgetting what they were. In the modal scales, the particular ornament on a note, the rhythm that breathes rather than marches. It is in the way certain communities were organized, the instinct for a school before almost anything else was settled, the habit of collective governance learned in a kirk session and applied in a backcountry meeting house. These things persisted without being consciously preserved. They were simply how people lived. Linguists who studied the dialects of remote Appalachian communities in the 20th century found something they had not expected. Words and grammatical structures that had disappeared from standard English 2 and 3 centuries earlier were still in daily use. The mountains had preserved them. The mountains had preserved the people, and the people had preserved the language. Tonight we follow the first part of this story, the Highland clans, their world and how it worked, before the disruptions that would eventually send so many of them across an ocean. The Lowlanders, shaped by a different Scotland of borough towns and parish schools and fiercely independent kirk sessions. The Ulster Scots, who were already emigrants before they were Americans, and the crossing itself. Tomorrow night, if you return, we follow the settlers into the mountains and across the Appalachian Ranges, into the backcountry of the Carolinas and Virginia, and what would become Tennessee. We will follow the music and the language and the habits of community they carried with them. The third night will bring us forward to the builders, the inventors, the political thinkers, and then to the long memory of these families across the centuries, the genealogy searches and the graveyards, and the word in Scots Gaelic that means a hereditary belonging to a particular piece of land, a belonging that no ocean voyage quite erases. But tonight is the beginning, the source. Tonight we go back to the glen before the leaving to understand what was there worth carrying and what it cost to carry it, and why, across all the hardship of crossing and settlement and starting over, so much of it survived. This is not only a story of grand figures. The 40 to 50 million Americans with Scottish ancestry did not descend primarily from famous men. They descend from farmers and weavers and cotters and linen workers and fisherfolk and ministers and small tradespeople who left their names in parish registers rather than history books. Most of them are nameless to us now, or nearly so, a family with a Bible that records 3 or 4 generations, a name in a ship's manifest, a land grant in a colonial courthouse that places a family in a Carolina county in a particular decade without explaining where they came from or what the crossing cost them. But they were real. Each of them made a decision or had a decision made for them and got on a ship and crossed the water and built something. The famous men rose from that soil. Carnegie came from a weaver's family. Muir came from a farm. The inventors and the founders were the children and grandchildren of people nobody now remembers by name. That is the first thing to know about the Scottish contribution to America. It was not the work of an elite. It was broad and dispersed and mostly anonymous, woven into the ordinary fabric of communities across a continent. the work of a whole people, not a handful of remarkable individuals. So as you settle into this first night, let that frame rest gently over everything that follows. A small nation, an enormous inheritance, a thread that runs, unbroken if not always easy to see, from a Highland glen at dusk to an Appalachian hollow at dusk, across 300 years and 3,000 miles of open water. The sky above both places is the same sky tonight, the light going the same way westward past caring which hills are holding it. In one valley, the heather, in the other, the hardwood trees of the southern mountains. Between them, the Atlantic, dark and enormous and entirely crossed. Scotland does not know it sent so many of itself across that water. It is a small country, and it has been occupied with its own long story, its own weather and its own politics, and its own complicated relationship with the larger nation that sits on its southern border. But every summer, in fields and parks across America, the pipes play and the hammer throwers prepare and the clan tents go up. And something that left Scotland 200 and 300 years ago and was supposed to dissolve into the general American mixture is still perfectly recognizable, still itself. We will ask over these 3 nights why that is, why this particular culture proved so persistent, why the songs survived the ocean and the language survived the mountains, and the habits of governance survived the revolution, and the longing for the glen survived even when the people longing had never seen a glen. Part of the answer is that the Scots who came to America were already good at not disappearing. They had practiced it in Scotland, where the clans maintained their identity against considerable external pressure. They had practiced it in Ulster, where the Presbyterian community kept its distinct shape inside a country that was not entirely friendly to it. They arrived in America already equipped with the skills of cultural survival. The kirk, the school, the communal governance, the oral tradition, the music that did not need paper or instruments to move from one generation to the next. These were the technologies of persistence, and they were very good technologies. There is something to rest within that if you carry these surnames. Not pride exactly, though pride is in it. Something more like recognition. The thing that feels most essentially yours, the stubbornness, the dry wit, the instinct to build a school before you build much else, the love of a high place at the end of the day that did not come from nowhere. It came from somewhere specific, from a particular set of hills and a particular set of circumstances and a particular set of people who made particular decisions. Over these 3 nights, we will go and find them. Let the light go now in both valleys. The Highland glen, the heather settling into grey, the burn still audible below. The Appalachian hollow, the mist coming down off the ridge, the creek running, the first star showing above the tree line. The same star, the same dusk, doing what dusk does everywhere, softening things, releasing the sharpness of the day, bringing what is close into relief against the gathering dark. The house, the fire, the people inside, the world outside, patient and enormous. Let those 2 valleys be with you tonight as the story finds you. They are patient places, both of them. They have held longer stories than this one and will hold longer ones still. For now, they hold this, the beginning of the thread, the first night. You do not need to stay awake for any of it. The history will move around you as you drift. It has been waiting 3 centuries. It can wait a little longer. Let it find you at whatever depth of sleep you arrive at. There is more story than night, and the night is doing what it does. The burn in the Highland glen, the creek in the Appalachian hollow, both of them running now in the dark over the stones they have always run over, carrying the water downhill the way water always goes, toward the sea, the same dark water that connects every departure to every arrival. Rest now, the clans are ahead of us, the world they built and the world that broke it, but not yet. For now, only the dusk and the quiet and the 2 valleys settling into the same night under the same patient sky. Asleep. Chapter 2, The Highland Clans. To understand why Scots left, you need to understand what they left. Not as it has sometimes been painted, wild and romantic, and dressed in tartan, as it actually was, as the people who lived it actually lived it. The Highlands in the centuries before the great emigrations were organized around the clan. The word itself comes from the Gaelic clan. It means children or offspring. A clan was, at its heart, an extended family with all the warmth and the weight that implies. Think about what that word holds. Not an alliance, not a faction. Children, everyone within the bond was a kind of relation. The chief was, in the older understanding, the father of his people, not in sentiment alone, in obligation. The chief sat at the top of the structure, but his power was not simply imposed from above. It rested on the loyalty of the people beneath him, and that loyalty was a relationship. He owed them protection. They owed him service. It was mutual, if unequal. Below the chief were the tacksmen, men of middling rank. They held land in trust from the chief and sublet it to the families who worked it. They were the middle layer of Highland society, kinsmen of the chief, literate usually, sometimes educated in the Lowland manner. The tacksman collected rents and managed the land. He also led his tenants in war when the chief called for it. He was a practical man. He knew the ground, knew the people, was answerable in both directions at once. Below the tacksmen were the ordinary farming families, the cotters and the subtenants who made up the great body of Highland life. They grew the oats and the barley. They tended the cattle. They cut the peat. Their lives were the substance of what the clan actually was. The townships they lived in were small. A handful of families, sometimes fewer. A cluster of low buildings against a hillside, choosing their ground carefully, near water, below the worst of the wind, where the land was deep enough to work. The houses were low, built from stone and turf and roofed with thatch. The records call them black houses, and the name fits. The walls were thick, the windows small, the interior dark and close. They were built to hold warmth, not to admit light. A central hearth in the main room, no chimney in the oldest ones, just a hole in the roof, and the smoke finding its way out as it pleased. Peat burning slow and fragrant. The smell of it was the smell of home. Scots who emigrated carried that memory for the rest of their lives. Peat, it is worth pausing on peat. The bogs of the Highlands had been growing for thousands of years, layers of compressed heather and moss and thyme. Cutting and drying it for fuel was one of the great communal labors of the year. The smell of it is unlike anything else. Low, earthy, sweet in its way. A fire built on peat does not blaze, it glows. It holds its heat steadily for hours without drama. The house built around a peat fire was a house built around patience. The fire asked you to slow down, and the house took its character from that. Cattle were often wintered in the same building or in a byre attached directly to the house. The warmth of the animals kept the family warmer. It sounds crude at a distance. It was intelligent. It was a sensible response to a cold landscape with no other source of heat. A family might have a handful of black cattle, small, shaggy, hardy animals suited to the Highland terrain. They were not worked in the fields in the same way as horses. They were the measure of wealth. A man's standing in his community was counted in cattle. The records say so plainly. In summer, the cattle moved up to the high pastures. This was shealing, the seasonal migration to the hill grazings. Whole families sent their young people up with the animals in May or June. They lived in small bothies on the slopes and came back in the autumn. The shealings were a different life. Higher ground, longer light. The freedom of the hills after the close confinement of winter. The young people made butter and cheese from the milk, sang together in the evenings, and came back to the township changed by the summer in ways they could not quite name. There was something in shealing life that lodged in memory more warmly than almost anything else. The accounts that survive from people who had left Scotland entirely come back to those summers with a particular tenderness. The high ground, the clear water, the unenclosed hours. The agricultural year had its rhythms. The land was worked in run-rig, strips shared out among families in rotation. No one family held the best ground exclusively. No one family suffered the worst ground alone. The system was communal to its core. Planting and harvesting ran on communal labor. At harvest, everyone helped everyone. At peat cutting, neighbors worked in lines across the bog. The fabric of daily life was woven between households, not within single ones. You could not survive alone. You were not meant to. The tools were simple. A caskrome, a footplough with a curved blade, worked into stony ground that a heavier implement could not manage. A creel for carrying peat down from the hill on a person's back. The work was physical and slow. The body was the machine. Evenings gathered in. After the work was done and the fire was built up, the day did not simply end. People moved between houses. A ceilidh, the word means a visit, a gathering, was not an organized event. It was just what people did when darkness came and there was nowhere else to be. Someone might play a fiddle, someone might sing, someone might begin a story. The Seenachie, the keeper of oral history, held a specific and respected place in this evening world. His role was not entertainment alone, it was custody. He remembered the genealogies. He knew who descended from whom back 4 and 5 and 6 generations. He knew the names of cattle stolen in disputes 3 generations past. He knew the migrations, the battles, the pacts, the broken pacts. The community's past lived inside him. This was not a casual arrangement. It was a serious responsibility. Without the Senachie's memory, the community lost its past. His recall was the only record that existed. He was, in the deepest sense, a library, one that breathed and walked and ate at the chief's table. Music was not separate from daily life. It was woven through it. There were songs for every kind of work, walking songs for the rhythmic communal work of shrinking and softening newly woven cloth. Women sat in lines and passed the cloth between them, and the song set the pace. There were rowing songs for the boats, laments for the dead, mouth music, pure to bugle, for dancing when no instrument was available, just voice, keeping the rhythm, carrying the tune. The Gaelic language had a quality of musicality that shaped everything it touched. A child born into a Highland township in the 17th or 18th century was surrounded by song before they could speak. They heard it at work. They heard it at the fire. They fell asleep to it. Music was not something you attended. It was something you were inside. The web of obligation ran in every direction. A tenant owed the chief military service when called. The chief owed the tenant protection from outside threat. A man owed his neighbor labor at the harvest. The neighbor owed the same in return. The whole structure was reciprocal duty. This was not always comfortable. Obligation could constrain. The chief's word carried weight that could not easily be refused. A taxman could make a tenant's life difficult. The obligations ran upward as well as downward, but power was not equally distributed. And yet, the web of duty meant that no family faced disaster entirely alone. A bad harvest hit everyone. The community absorbed some of what hardship brought. There was no poor relief in the modern sense. The clan itself was the poor relief. In the great hall of a chief, things were grander. Long tables, fires at both ends of the room. The Senachie would stand and recite. Hospitality was a serious obligation. A chief who fed his guests poorly was spoken of with contempt. The stories told after supper on a winter night could last until very late. Children grew up hearing those stories, hearing the genealogies recited as naturally as the weather was discussed. A child in a Highland township knew their family's history back 5, 6, 7 generations without the aid of any written record. This was considered ordinary. It was. Religion sat alongside older ways without obvious conflict. Christianity had been in Scotland since the early centuries. In the Highlands, it had layered over practices that were older still, a knowledge of plants and their particular uses, an attention to certain days in the year. The cattle were blessed at Beltane in spring. The hearth fire was managed with care at certain turns of the season. These were not in conflict with the church in most people's minds. They were simply how you lived carefully in a landscape that could be generous or harsh with very little warning. Daily food was plain. Oatmeal was the staple, made into porridge into bannocks baked on a flat stone over the fire, kale where it could be grown, milk from the cattle and goats, fish where the land lay near water. Meat was not daily fare for ordinary families. Whiskey was distilled on many small farms, not as a luxury, as a practical use of surplus grain in years when there was surplus, and as a medicine and as a social bond. A dram offered and accepted was a statement of trust. Refusing was a statement too. The land itself was not owned in the way it came to be owned. The chief held it in a kind of stewardship, granted by the crown, sublet downwards. Ordinary people had customary rights to use land their families had worked for generations. Those rights felt like permanence. They were not. There is the fragility. The whole structure rested on custom rather than written contract. It rested on relationships rather than law. It rested on the chief's willingness to act as father rather than landlord. When that changed, everything built on it became uncertain. The obligations that held the clan together also held it in a particular shape. If the chief decided to change the terms, the people had limited legal recourse. The very closeness of the web meant that when it tore in every direction at once. They knew the hills, they knew the names of every field, every stream, every ridge. The landscape was not anonymous to them. It was intimate, named, storied, alive with the presence of those who had worked it before. Every feature had a history attached to it. A particular bend in the burn where the cattle liked to drink. A shelf of rock halfway up the hill where you could get out of the wind. A patch of ground where the soil went dark and rich, and the oats always came up better. These things were knowledge held in common. That intimacy with a specific place, that deep and particular knowing of one valley, one set of hills, one community, is what makes emigration so hard to understand from outside. These were not rootless people. They were among the most rooted people imaginable. The uprooting was real, and it was total. But before we arrive at the leaving, we should sit a little longer with what was. The fire burning low, the peat smoke drifting, a child asleep on a heather-stuffed mattress, a woman spinning at the edge of the firelight, a man sharpening a blade in the low glow. The world outside dark and cold and entirely familiar. The Seenachie in the corner near the fire not speaking tonight. He has spoken enough. He is simply there, the way memory is simply there, patient and undemanding, available when you need it, and quiet when you do not. What was strong in that world? The web of mutual duty, the communal work, the music braided through everything, the knowledge held in memory, the sense of belonging to a specific place and a specific people that most of us today would find difficult to imagine. What was fragile? That the whole structure rested on relationships, not rights, on custom, not contract, on the willingness of those at the top to honor the obligations they owed downward. The web was strong until the people holding one side let go. This was the life that shaped the people who would eventually cross an ocean. Not an easy life, a hard life with real beauty in it and real warmth, and a deep sense of belonging that survived the crossing, changed by the ocean, changed by new ground, but not erased. The mountains stood the same then as they stand now, the same light on the same locks, the same peat smell rising from the same bogs. If you have been to the Highlands, you have seen what they saw. If you have not, something in the description of it may feel familiar anyway. Memory is strange that way. Tonight let the black house settle around you. The fire, the smell of peat, the slow breathing of the cattle next door, the sound of the burn outside, always there, always the same, regardless of what century the calendar claims. These are your people if you carry those surnames, or they are simply people worth knowing, worth resting with for a while, on a quiet night when sleep is finding you slowly. Let them be close, let the glen be close. The Seenachie has gone quiet, the fire has settled. Somewhere on the hill the cattle are still. There is more story to come, but there is no hurry. The story will still be there when you are ready. For now, just the fire and the dark outside and the mountains exactly where they have always been. And Chapter 3, The Lowlanders. The other Scotland begins not in the glens, but in the grey stone boroughs. Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee, Perth, Aberdeen, streets of merchants and ministers, weavers at their looms, schoolboys bent over slates in smoky parish classrooms. This was the Lowlands, and it shaped America in ways just as deep as any Highland chief. The Lowlands are not a single thing. They range from the flat carsh of Gowrie, where the fields run wide and the sky is enormous, to the steep wines of Edinburgh's Old Town, where five-story tenements lean toward each other above the closes. Different landscapes, different economies, different sounds, but certain things ran through all of it. The language was Scots, not Gaelic, a Germanic tongue cousin to English with its own grammar and its own music, Drike for grey weather, Thole for enduring something that cannot be changed, Canny for careful and shrewd. These were not mere dialect words. They were ways of thinking compressed into sound. The boroughs had been granted royal charters since the medieval period. A borough was a trading town with rights to hold a market, to levy tolls, to regulate its own trades through the guild system. The merchant guild and the craft incorporations sat at the center of borough life, and membership was earned, not inherited. A right applied to his incorporation. A weaver served his apprenticeship and was examined by the masters of his trade. A merchant proved his goods and his credit before he was admitted. Competence was the currency of the borough system. The records kept. The standards were defended. In Edinburgh's Lawn Market, cloth merchants hung their bolts from wooden frames. In Glasgow's Trongate, tobacco and sugar moved through counting houses run by men who thought in columns of figures. In Dundee, coarse linen was woven in houses along every close. These were not romantic trades, they were exacting ones. The Reformation came to Scotland in 1560 and changed everything. John Knox and the church that followed him believed one thing above all: every person must be able to read the Bible for themselves. That meant schools. That meant a nation that took literacy as a religious duty, not a privilege of the wealthy. The parish school system was the result. By law, every parish was to maintain a schoolmaster, paid from local funds, available to the children of farmers and tradesmen alongside those of lairds. The law was imperfect in the Highlands, and in some poor rural parishes the schoolmaster was a threadbare figure, but the idea held. By the 1700s, Scotland had one of the highest literacy rates in Europe. Travellers noticed it. Visitors from England and France commented on it with a mixture of admiration and something close to surprise. A blacksmith who could read, a farm servant who had opinions about theology. These things were not common elsewhere. This was not an accident. It was theology made into policy and then into habit. The Kirk believed the ordinary person had the right and the duty to engage with Scripture directly. A congregation that could not read was a congregation dependent on the priest to mediate the Word of God. The Kirk had broken with that arrangement. The parish schoolmaster was a figure of some standing and some hardship. He taught Latin alongside reading and arithmetic. He drilled catechism. In small boroughs, he might also serve as session clerk, keeping the official records of the congregation, marriages and baptisms, and disciplinary cases, in a hand clear enough to be read a century later. That hand can still be read. In archives across Scotland, the parish registers survive in their thousands, written by men who had been taught to write carefully and had then taught others. The chain of literacy is visible in the records themselves, generation by generation, the handwriting improving and then varying and then improving again. The Kirk session was more than a school board. It was a governing body that reached into every corner of parish life. It recorded births and deaths. It investigated allegations of misconduct. It ordered public repentance from a stone seat at the front of the church, in full view of the congregation, for those who had strayed from the expected path. This discipline was not always welcome. It could be intrusive and harsh, but it produced something, a habit of accounting for oneself in public, of submitting private conduct to communal judgment. That habit had consequences. The Lowland Scots who emigrated to America brought with them an expectation that communities had the right to govern themselves and the duty to govern themselves honestly. The universities fed the same current. Scotland had 5 universities by the late 17th century, when England had 2: Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews, Aberdeen, Marischal College. They were not finishing schools for the wealthy. They admitted boys from modest families on bursaries. A farmer's son who showed ability could end up in a lecture hall in Edinburgh. The curriculum was not narrow. Philosophy and mathematics alongside theology. The natural world as a subject worthy of study. A student at Edinburgh in the 1690s might study medicine and moral philosophy in the same year. The breadth was deliberate. It produced a kind of graduate who could think across categories, which turned out to be useful in a new country. The weavers deserve particular attention. In towns like Paisley, Hamilton, and Lanark, the loom was the central fact of life. Handloom weaving was skilled work. A Paisley weaver producing fine figured cloth, the intricate pattern work that made Paisley fabric famous across Europe, was operating a machine of real complexity and following a design that left no room for error. The precision was physical. The count of threads per inch, The tension on the warp, the sequence of the shed and the shuttle repeated thousands of times in a single piece. A mistake was visible immediately. The weaver learned early that carelessness was not recoverable. The cloth either held its pattern or it did not. Weaving communities were also often reading communities. The handloom weaver worked at home or in a small shop, and the pace of the work allowed for thinking. Reading aloud was common, a boy employed to read to the weavers while they worked. Burns was read this way. Political pamphlets were read this way. The weavers of Paisley were, by several accounts, among the most politically engaged communities in Scotland. The merchants looked outward. Glasgow's rise in the 18th century was built on Atlantic trade, tobacco from Virginia, sugar from the Caribbean, cotton later. The Glasgow tobacco lords walked the Trongate in red cloaks as a mark of their status, and some of their wealth was extraordinary by any measure. They knew the Atlantic world well. They had agents in every significant port. Those agents were often Scots. A young man from a Glasgow counting house, trained in the ledger and the letter of credit, would be sent to Virginia or Maryland to manage the tobacco stores. He lived among the planters, extended credit to them, took their crop on account. He knew the Chesapeake as well as he knew the Clyde. This was one of the first sustained Scottish presences in America, not dramatic emigrants fleeing famine or clearance. Young men in commerce, doing business, writing home, observing the new country with a merchant's attentive and calculating eye. Some of them stayed. Others returned to Scotland with a knowledge of America that few of their contemporaries had. The ministers came too, by a different route. Presbyterian congregations in the American colonies needed pastors. Scotland had trained more ministers than it had parishes. Edinburgh and Glasgow sent clergy to New Jersey, to Virginia, to the Carolinas. A minister crossing the Atlantic in 1720 was often carrying something beyond himself: a letter from a presbytery, a commission from a congregation, a small library that had been presented to him on the quayside. Those libraries were practical objects. A minister in a newly settled area of Pennsylvania might be the most educated person within 30 miles. His books were not merely personal reading. They were the intellectual resource of the community. When the first schools were founded, when the first colleges were proposed, his books were often the founding collection. The ministers wrote letters home. Those letters circulated in Scotland and shaped what ordinary Scots knew about America. A minister describing the richness of the Pennsylvania soil, the availability of land, the tolerance for Presbyterian worship, was making an argument that many Lowland Scots found persuasive. The word came back in a voice they trusted. The schoolmasters followed, because every community the Scots built wanted a school quickly. A community that believed in literacy as a spiritual duty built the church first, and then the school, and the two were often in the same building for the first years. The schoolmaster's salary was a community commitment, contributed by families who understood that their children's ability to read was not optional. Lowland emigration looked different from Highland emigration in its texture and its timing. The Highland clearances, which would drive so many people off the land in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, had no direct equivalent in the Lowlands. Lowland farmers left for different reasons and by different routes. Some left because the improving agriculture of the 18th century was squeezing tenant farmers in ways that felt uncomfortably familiar. Landlords raised rents as new farming methods made the land more productive. A family that had farmed the same ground for generations might find that the profit went to the landlord and the risk remained with them. The calculation could tip toward leaving. Some left because the trade they depended on was vulnerable. The handloom weavers who emigrated in the early 19th century often did so with the power loom coming for them, not yet arrived, but clearly on its way. A skilled man looking at the horizon of his trade made his own reckoning. Better to go while the skill was still valuable than to wait until it was not. Some left because they had relatives already in America who had written back, a cousin in Philadelphia, an uncle who had taken up land in the Carolinas, a letter in careful handwriting, slightly formal, describing good soil and a Presbyterian congregation within a day's ride. The letter was read aloud, discussed, set aside, returned to. It was the first step in a decision that might take years. Others went more directly. Ministers accompanied their congregations. A church that had split over doctrine or whose minister had been removed by a presbytery decision the congregation rejected might resolve to emigrate as a body. The congregation crossed the Atlantic as a unit and reconstituted itself on the other side. The Kirk session reconvened. The records continued. What they brought was not primarily material. The furniture was left behind or sold. The house was given up. What they carried was the habit of the parish, the expectation of governance by elected elders, the belief that education was everyone's responsibility. These things took no space in a trunk. The counting house mind came too. The Lowland Scots had been trained in the ledger and the contract. They understood compound interest and the terms of credit. They could read a survey and understand what a land grant meant. When they arrived in America, they were not easily cheated, and when they set up their own arrangements, they were precise about them. This precision made them effective in the new country. A Scottish merchant who set up in Philadelphia came with connections, with a reputation for credit, with contacts on both sides of the Atlantic. He could offer things that a locally born trader without those networks could not. The Scottish trading networks in America were an extension of the Scottish trading networks at home. The craftsmen brought their standards. A Scottish carpenter, trained in the guild tradition, did not do approximate work. The joint was cut cleanly or it was cut again. The dimension was measured twice. The habits of the incorporation, the expectation of examination and approval had formed the hand. In a new country building itself from raw timber, that kind of workmanship was noticed. One thing the Lowlanders brought that is harder to trace but worth naming: a deep familiarity with argumentation. The parish schoolroom taught grammar and rhetoric. The Kirk session argued from first principles. The university debating societies practiced the formal presentation and rebuttal of positions. A Lowland Scot who had been through this system arrived in America with an ability to construct and defend a case that was not universal. That ability mattered when the colonies moved towards self-governance. The committees and conventions that formed in the 1770s needed people who could draft a position paper, argue it publicly, respond to challenge, revise. The Scots who had come through the parish school and the college debating hall were comfortable in those rooms in a way that was rooted in a very specific educational tradition. The first Atlantic ventures, the very earliest Lowland Scots who crossed to America, often went as part of commercial arrangements rather than emigrant parties. A factor for a Glasgow merchant house, living in a Virginia warehouse, sleeping in a room above the tobacco. A physician who had studied at Edinburgh and found his way to Charleston. A minister sent by a presbytery to a congregation that had written asking for one. These were not the great waves of later emigration. They were individual crossings made for particular reasons, and the people who made them were often planning to return. Some did, but some found, after a season or two in America, that the possibility of remaining was worth considering. The land was real. The opportunity was real. The return was not compulsory. The first Scottish church in America is generally identified as the Scots Charitable Society of Boston, founded in 1657, or the early Presbyterian congregations of New Jersey and New York. By the early 18th century, Scottish communities were established in most significant colonial towns. They recognized each other. They lent each other money. They hired each other. The women in this story were not bystanders. A weaver's wife often worked the loom alongside her husband. A merchant's wife managed the household accounts and, in her husband's absence, the business. A minister's wife ran the parsonage and often the informal school that sat behind the formal one. The records are thinner for women, but the labor is not absent from them. A woman emigrating from a lowland borough in 1730 carried skills that were immediately useful in a new settlement. She knew how to manage a limited larder through a hard winter. She knew the basics of domestic medicine, the plants that eased fever, the preparations that kept food through summer. She knew how to produce cloth from raw fiber. These were not small things. The Kirk Session Minute books, when they survive, are extraordinary documents. They record the texture of community life in a way that official records do not. A dispute about a boundary fence resolved by the session. A woman who came before the elders to report a neighbor's unkindness. A family that could not afford the schoolmaster's fee and the session's decision to subsidize them. Community governance, in practice, at its most granular. Some of those minute books were carried to America. A congregation that emigrated as a body brought its records with it. The first entry in a Virginia Session Minute book is sometimes a brief note that the previous volume was kept in Scotland, that the congregation has now constituted itself in the new country, and that the present minister is so-and-so, ordained in such a place, by such a date. Continuity insisted upon. Close your eyes for a moment. You are in a borough schoolroom. It is early morning, candles on the master's desk, the smell of tallow and cold stone. Small hands hold slates carefully. Outside, carts are beginning to move on the cobbles. A bell sounds from the parish church, the same bell that called these children's parents to school. The master reads aloud from a Latin text, He asks a question. A boy near the back raises his hand. He is the son of a weaver. His boots are worn. His answer is careful and correct. The master nods, which is all the praise he gives. The boy will be a minister. His son will be a doctor. His granddaughter will teach in Pennsylvania. That chain, from the smoky classroom in a lowland borough to a one-room schoolhouse in the American backcountry, is not metaphor. It is the record. The parish school tradition did not die at the waterline. It crossed. It planted itself in ground that had never seen it before and grew into something that still shapes American education. The difference between the Lowlands and the Highlands was real, but it should not be overstated. Both were Scotland. Both sent people to America carrying something that persisted. The Highland emigrant carried a culture of oral memory and communal belonging. The Lowlander carried a culture of written record and argued principle. In the new country, both were needed. The borough towns stand today, recognizable and changed. The toll booths and the guild halls, the closes and the wines, the parish churches whose records go back 3 centuries. If you trace your family to one of those towns through a surname or a record or a letter in a drawer, you are tracing it to a world that was literate and argumentative and exact and deeply serious about the education of children. That is the inheritance. Not gold, not land, not power, though some of them accumulated all 3. The inheritance is a particular habit of mind, that the ordinary person has the right to read the document placed before them, the right to argue the case, the right to know. The Lowlanders carried that across the Atlantic. In America, it found considerable use. Now the day is quiet. The schoolroom is empty. The slates are clean. The master has gone home, and the cobbles outside are still, and the only sound is the burn that runs under the borough, as it has always run, carrying the water from the hills down to the sea. The same water, the same stone, the night coming in over the same rooftops. In Chapter 4, the Ulster Scots. To understand how so many Scots arrived on the American frontier, you must first follow them to Ireland. It is a step most people overlook, and it explains almost everything that comes after. The short sea crossing between Scotland and the north of Ireland is barely 20 miles at its narrowest point. On a clear day, standing on the Ayrshire coast, you can make out the hills of Antrim across the water. People had been crossing in both directions for centuries before any government thought to organize it. In the early 1600s, the English crown moved to plant the northern province of Ulster with settlers who would, in theory, hold the land steady. Ulster had been turbulent. A long resistance had finally broken in 1607, and its Gaelic lords had departed for the continent. The plantation that followed was deliberate and systematic. Thousands of Scottish families took the offer. Most came from the Lowlands and the southwest, from Ayrshire and Galloway and Lanarkshire, places where the soil was familiar and the theology was already Presbyterian. The sea between them and Ulster was not an obstacle. It was a lane they already knew. They came for land. The terms were specific. Settlers would receive parcels of ground in exchange for improving it, paying rent to English or Scottish landlords who had been granted the confiscated estates. The land itself had belonged to Gaelic Irish families for generations. That fact did not go away simply because it was not spoken of. The Gaelic Irish who had farmed that land were not gone. They remained, pushed to the margins of their own country, working the poorer ground, present as tenants and labourers on land that had been taken from their own community not a generation before. The plantation was not settlement into an empty province. It was settlement into a wound. The Scottish settlers built communities. They erected Presbyterian kirks with familiar forms of governance. They established schools because a congregation that believed every person should read scripture for themselves was a congregation that built classrooms. The habit traveled intact across the narrow water. They planted crops in the Irish soil and found it productive. They kept cattle and brought their own farming methods with them. Within a generation, the townships of Antrim and Down and Londonderry had the texture of Scottish communities transposed to a different landscape. The same stone buildings, the same kirk discipline, the same tight web of neighbour obligation. Linen changed everything. The flax plant came with the settlers and the skills to process it. Ulster linen became something the whole of Europe noticed. The cloth had a quality that commanded a price. By the late 1600s, the linen trade was the economic spine of the whole province, and the Scottish-descended weavers at its centre were men and women who understood the relationship between careful work and a living wage. The towns that grew around the linen trade had a particular character. Lisburn, Lurgan, Banbridge, markets with a purposeful air, merchants who could calculate a thread count and a price and a shipping rate without writing any of it down. It was Lowland Scottish commercial culture, replanted and grown in Irish earth. The language they spoke was Scots, a variant of the English that had developed differently north of the border, with its own rhythms and vocabulary. In the Ulster they settled, it sat alongside Irish Gaelic, alongside English, alongside a patchwork of other tongues brought by planters from different parts of Britain. The province was a place of many voices speaking past each other. Their faith was not negotiable. The Presbyterian conviction that the congregation governed itself, that no bishop stood between a person and God, that every elder had a voice in the running of the church, this was not mere custom. It was the framework through which they understood authority in every domain. A community that had no bishop in its church was skeptical of bishops everywhere. For a generation, then two, then most of three, the Ulster Scots put down roots. The names in the parish registers accumulated: Hamilton, Ferguson, Campbell, Boyd, Wallace, Crawford, Graham. Families who had arrived with a single farm lease became established. Children grew up knowing no other landscape. The narrow sea behind them faded into the past tense. The stability was real. It was also conditional. The leases on which everything rested came up for renewal at the landlord's pleasure. Rents were not fixed. They were whatever the landlord could persuade or compel the tenant to pay. In good times, the tenants paid and stayed. When times shifted, the ground shifted with them. The 1640s brought the first serious disruption. The Catholic Irish Rising of 1641 tore through Ulster with a violence that left a mark on the settler communities for generations. Thousands died. The memories of that period were carried forward in the community's sense of itself as a people under threat, Protestant and Presbyterian, in a province where the politics of religion never simplified. The years that followed were unsettled ones for the entire island. The Cromwellian period, the restoration of the monarchy, the Revolution of 1688, each brought its own upheaval. The Battle of the Boyne in 1690, in which the Protestant King William defeated the Catholic King James, was fought on Irish soil and settled in Ulster memory as the event that secured Protestant survival. The echoes of that year are still audible today. By the early 1700s, the Ulster Scots were a people with a specific and complicated identity. They were not English. They were not Irish. They were Presbyterian and Scots descended, with a century of Ulster soil under their feet and a church that was viewed with suspicion by both the Catholic majority and the Anglican establishment. The Test Act of 1704 was the specific instrument of that Anglican suspicion. It required all holders of public office to receive communion according to the rites of the Church of Ireland. For Presbyterians, this was not a small inconvenience. It was a declaration that they were second-class subjects in the country their families had helped to build. Ministers who had led congregations for decades were removed from their posts. Officers who had served loyally were required to conform or resign. The community that had planted itself in Ulster at the Crown's invitation was now told, in clear legal language, that the Crown regarded its religion as insufficiently correct. Some complied, most did not. The Presbyterian tradition had a word for yielding to unjust authority on matters of conscience. It was called Erastianism, the subordination of the church to the state, and it was regarded as a kind of spiritual surrender. The Test Act was endured, but it was not forgotten. On top of the religious pressure came the economic one. The woolen trade that many Ulster families had been part of was restricted in the 1690s by legislation protecting English manufacturers. A successful enterprise was hobbled by law from a distance, by people who had no interest in Ulster beyond its commercial competition. The linen trade survived, but the wound of the woolen restriction was fresh. Then the rents. In the 1710s, landlords began to see that their Ulster estates could command higher returns. Leases came up for renewal, and the new terms were significantly steeper. Tenants who had improved their land over decades, who had cleared it and drained it and built on it, found themselves paying for the work they had done as if the landlord had done it for them. A family that had been comfortable became pressed. A family that had been pressed became desperate. The calculation that had once made Ulster look like an opportunity now had to be run again, with different numbers. When you added up the rent, the tithe to a church you did not attend, the restrictions on your trade and your civic life, the sum was a question you had to ask aloud. Why are we staying? And then word came about Pennsylvania. William Penn had been advertising his colony for several decades. The terms were different from anything they had known in Scotland or Ulster. Religious tolerance written into the founding documents. good land available for purchase at reasonable terms, the right to worship as you chose without penalty, a government that did not ask what church you attended before it allowed you to vote. To a community that had spent a generation being told its religion was inadequate, the concept of religious tolerance was not an abstraction. It was an answer to a wound that was still open. Pennsylvania was not just land. It was the thing they had been denied at home. The first significant wave left around 1717 and 1718. It had been preceded by years of correspondence, of letters from earlier arrivals in the colonies describing the country, the prices, the neighbors, the soil. The move was not impulsive. It was researched, discussed, prayed over, and planned by people who were accustomed to making careful decisions. The minister was often the organizing force. He had the literacy, the networks, the authority within the community to coordinate what was in every practical sense a complex logistical undertaking. He negotiated with ship captains. He held the community together across the weeks of waiting. He would preach on the quayside before the ship left, and then preach again when it arrived. A congregation did not always emigrate whole. More often, a family or two went first. They wrote back. The letters described the land honestly. The winters were hard, the clearing was brutal, the first years were bare survival. But the land was theirs, no landlord above them, the deed in their name. That single fact made the honest hardship worth reading about. There is something particular about families who had already crossed one water before they crossed the Atlantic. The Ulster Scots knew what emigration was. They carried the memory of the first crossing, even if it was now 2 or 3 generations back. They had left Scotland, built something, and now were being asked to leave again. That second departure carried a different kind of grief. The first leaving had been an adventure or a choice, or at least close enough to one that it could be told that way. The second was harder to frame. What they had built in Ulster was real. The linen mills, the kirks, the schools, the farms they had cleared and drained and improved. All of it had to be weighed against what they would find on the other side of the Atlantic. Some families split the decision. A son went ahead, the parents stayed, or a brother left and a brother remained. The correspondence that resulted is one of the more intimate records the period left behind. Letters in a cramped hand describing a creek in Pennsylvania or a mountain in Carolina, addressed to a person sitting in a farmhouse in Antrim or Down who would spend the rest of their life deciding whether to follow. What they carried in their bundles was practical and specific. The Bible, always the Bible, worn and familiar, seeds of varieties they trusted, tools whose weight they knew in their hands, a shuttle if they were weavers, a medical manual, since the nearest physician in the American backcountry might be a day's ride away. What they carried without choosing to carry, it was harder to inventory. A century of Ulster sitting in their bodies. The particular way their community organized itself, through the kirk session, through the elder system, through the habit of collective decision-making that went back to their Scottish origins. The expectation that a community builds its own school before almost anything else is settled. They carried a watchfulness. People who had been a religious minority in a hostile establishment, who had watched rents rise and rights contract, who had seen their trade restricted by distant legislation. They had learned to read authority with skepticism. They were not natural submitters to hierarchy. They had reasons not to be. They carried a specific grief that was not the grief of the Highlander. The Highlander mourned a landscape, a clan, a set of hills intimately known and named. The Ulster Scot mourned something more complicated, a place that had never been entirely home, a home built in someone else's country, now abandoned for a third country whose language they at least already spoke. They also carried a stubbornness that the records confirm from every direction. A people who had survived Calvinist theology in its strictest form, who had kept their faith under legal penalty, who had bent their backs to linen looms through generations and paid rent to absent landlords without breaking. Those people were not easily defeated by a difficult ocean or a hard first winter. The port of embarkation was often Larne or Belfast Lough or Derry. The ships that took them were small by any standard we would recognize. 200 tons, 150 souls packed below decks, the space between berths barely enough to turn in. The Atlantic crossing from an Irish port to Philadelphia took 6 to 8 weeks in favorable weather. The smell of it, salt water, unwashed wool, the bilge, the particular sourness of too many people in too little air for weeks on end. The food was what they had brought: oatmeal, dried meat, hard biscuit, water that tasted of the barrel. Parents counted their children in the dark. The Bible was read aloud when the sea was calm enough to hold the book still. People died on those crossings. Fever moved fast in close quarters. The dead were buried at sea, the words spoken at the rail by whoever had the steadiest voice. The living continued, because continuing was the only available direction. This is not sentiment. It is what the records say, plainly and without decoration. Children born at sea were named for the ocean or the ship that held them. Those births were logged. Some of those log entries are still readable in archives on both sides of the water. A name written in a clerk's hand 300 years ago, in a vessel rolling in mid-Atlantic, with a new child and the smell of salt and the sound of the ship speaking in its timbers. When land appeared, people wept. The records note it straightforwardly. Men and women who had held themselves controlled through weeks of the most difficult conditions stood at the rail and wept when the American coastline rose out of the sea. It was not weakness. It was the release of something held very tightly for a very long time. Philadelphia received more of these families than any other port in the colonial period. The city was already a place of many languages, many faiths, Germans and English and Irish and Welsh and Scots all moving through the same docks. An Ulster Scots family stepping off a ship in Philadelphia was not in alien territory. They were in the antechamber of something new. Most of them did not stay in the city. The city was a waypoint. They had not crossed 2 bodies of water to live in a street. They had come for ground. And ground in Pennsylvania meant moving inland, and inland meant the road that was already forming, south and west, down through the great valley, into the mountains. The land they moved through had been Lenape land, Shawnee land, Cherokee land, land that had been inhabited and managed, and named for thousands of years before any settler arrived. The trails they followed had been worn into existence by people who knew the country intimately and had traveled it for generations. That history did not stop being true because the settlers were arriving. Some settlements were peaceful, some were not. The frontier was a contested zone, and the records do not allow a simple narrative in either direction. The Ulster Scots who pushed furthest into the back country were often the families who ended up in the most direct conflict with native peoples who had every reason to resist the incursion. This is history told honestly, without a hero or a villain, only people on both sides of a collision that changed everything for all of them. What the Ulster Scots brought to that frontier was a specific set of qualities: a stubborn self-sufficiency, a familiarity with building from nothing, a religious framework that supported endurance, a skepticism of distant authority, and a plain inability to be discouraged by conditions that were merely very hard. They had been shaped for difficult country by difficult country twice over. The communities they built replicated what they had known: a kirk, a school, a common way of governing the congregation, and by extension the settlement. Presbyterian elders made decisions that, in the absence of any formal government, were the only decisions being made. The session meeting in a log building in the Carolina backcountry was the same institution, in its bones, as the session meeting in a stone kirk in Antrim. By the mid-1700s, tens of thousands of families had made this journey. The surnames that filled the church registers of Antrim and Down and Londonderry now filled the frontier church registers of Pennsylvania and Virginia and the Carolinas. Hamilton, Ferguson, Boyd, Crawford, Wallace, Graham, the names moved west with the families. They became, in time, what history calls the Scotch-Irish, a term that is not entirely satisfying to anyone, but is accurate in its components. Scots by origin, Irish by a century of residence, American by choice and necessity. A people who had been moved twice and who carried both journeys in their bodies, in their voices, in the way they organized a community and the speed with which they built a school. These were your people if you carry those surnames, or they were simply people worth knowing, worth resting with tonight. They crossed two seas and cleared two sets of ground and built something that held. They were tired often and stubborn always, and they carried their faith and their seeds and their tools into country that had never known them, and they stayed. Let them settle around you now. The crossing is behind them. The mountains are ahead. There is no hurry to arrive. They have earned the night, and so have you. Let the fire burn low. Let the dark outside stay where it is. The valley will still be there in the morning, waiting to be built, patient as all valleys are patient in the early hours before anyone wakes to begin the work. In Chapter 5, The Great Crossing. Let us come to the leaving now, not quickly and not looking away. The crossing was real, and the reasons behind it were real, and the people who made it carried both the grief and the hope in the same chest, crossing the same water at the same time. Many left because the life they had known was being taken apart around them. The clearances were not a single event. They were a process, spread across decades, that transformed the Highlands from a place of settled communities into something else entirely. The old clan system had fractured after Culloden in 1746. The chiefs, who had commanded loyalty in exchange for protection, became landlords who commanded rent. The relationship that had held communities together for generations shifted into something colder. Sheep were more profitable than people. That is the plain economics of it. A landlord who cleared his land of tenants and put it to sheep could raise his income substantially. The people on the land were not considered in the calculation. They were the cost. Families received notice to quit, sometimes weeks, sometimes days. The houses were often pulled down behind them or set alight so that there was no returning. Some of this happened quickly and brutally. Some happened slowly through rent rises that made staying impossible. The places these families had lived were not arbitrary. They were the ground their grandparents and great-grandparents had worked. The field names were in Gaelic. The grave were nearby. The burn they drank from was the same burn generations of the same family had drunk from. Leaving was not abstract. Some families were resettled on poor coastal land, expected to survive on kelp harvesting and fishing. The kelp trade collapsed. The fishing was unreliable. The land was thin. It was survival at best, and often something less than that. Others made for the towns. Glasgow and Dundee and Edinburgh absorbed people from the Highlands who arrived speaking Gaelic and knowing nothing of factory work. The mills took them. The conditions were hard. The language was foreign. The city was not home. And some left Scotland entirely. The emigration that had been a choice for earlier generations became, for many families in the Highland clearances, the only remaining option. The ship was not an adventure. It was the last door in a closing corridor. Hunger pressed elsewhere too. The potato famine that struck Ireland in the 1840s reached into the Western Isles of Scotland. The people there had come to depend on the potato as much as the Irish had. When the blight came, it came here too. The records from Skye and Lewis and South Uist in 1847 and 1848 are painful to read. So the emigrant ships that left Scottish ports carried people of several kinds. Those who calculated and chose, those who were given no choice, those who fled hunger, those who followed neighbors and family who had already gone. The ships did not distinguish between them. The vessel itself was the first shock. Those who had never seen an ocean ship stood on the quay and understood, perhaps for the first time, the real distance they were proposing to cross. The ship was not large. The ocean, visible now, was. Emigrant ships in the period of the Great Clearance crossings were often former cargo vessels, reconfigured to carry human freight. The betweendecks, the space below the main deck, had been fitted with rough wooden berths in tiers. The clearance between a sleeping person and the berth above was sometimes less than 2 feet. Ventilation was minimal. When the hatches were battened down in bad weather, the air below decks became what it became. The passengers knew this going in. They went anyway because the alternative was behind them. A family's space was their berth and the floor in front of it. Everything they owned fitted into that space. Luggage was stored where it could be, wedged against the ship's ribs, stacked on any flat surface. The berth was sleeping quarters, living quarters, sick room, if it came to that. The Highlands' departure ports were often the lochside piers. In Vergorden, Cromarty, Ullapool, Tobermory, sometimes a smaller boat took people out to a larger vessel anchored in deeper water. Sometimes families waited on open quaysides in all weathers before boarding. There was singing sometimes. The accounts note it. Gaelic songs at the point of departure, sung by people on the quay to the people on the ship, and sung back. The specific songs are not always recorded. The fact of singing is, it was the Scottish way of doing what could not be done in plain speech. The ship moved. The land receded. Those who could not bear to watch turned away. Those who could not bear not to watch stood at the rail until the last headland was gone, and there was nothing but open water and the cold, particular light of the North Atlantic. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, sometimes 10. The time at sea depended on season, prevailing winds, the quality of the ship, and a measure of fortune that nobody could predict or purchase. Every day was a day further from what had been left, and not yet closer to what would be found. Life organized itself into routines. Meals were cooked on a small communal stove on deck when the weather permitted. The ration was fixed and limited. Oatmeal again, as it had been at home, water from the barrels, a piece of salt meat when it was issued. People stretched their own supplies to fill the gaps. Children adapted quickly, as children do. They found the ship's geography and mastered it. They knew which ropes could be held, which hatches led where, which sailors would answer a question and which would not. The ship became a world, small but navigable, and they navigated it. Adults found the sameness harder. Week after week of the same horizon, the same motion, the same faces in the same confined space. Quarrels happened, were contained mostly because there was nowhere to go. Reconciliation happened too. The crossing made certain friendships permanent in the way that shared hardship tends to. Illness traveled fast on the emigrant ships. Fever, dysentery, the unnamed conditions that bloom in close quarters with poor sanitation. Ship fever, the emigrants called it. The doctors call it typhus. The records of mortality on the emigrant runs are not comfortable reading. A burial at sea had a particular quality of finality that a shore burial did not. No grave to return to, no marker. The ocean took what was committed to it and gave nothing back. Those who had watched someone go into the water carried that image for the rest of their lives. When the weather was calm and the sky was clear, the ocean at night showed something that people from the Scottish Highlands had seen before in the same sky, but never from the open water. Stars from horizon to horizon, uninterrupted, the Milky Way pulling overhead like a white road going somewhere. People sat on deck and watched it and said very little. Signs of land came first to the sailors and then noticed by passengers watching carefully to everyone. The color of the water changed. Flotsam appeared. Seabirds that belonged to shores, not to open ocean. A smell, faint at first, that was not salt water. It was vegetation, earth, something alive and rooted. The coastline of America in the colonial period presented itself as trees. an immensity of trees, dark green along the horizon, unlike anything any of them had seen. Scotland has its forests, but they are modest in scale. What they were approaching was a continent forested to its edges. The scale was outside any frame they had. Coming up the Delaware River to Philadelphia, or through the Narrows into New York Harbor, or toward the low barrier islands of the Carolina coast, the passengers crowded every available space on deck. The weeping that the records note was not sentimental. It was the body releasing what the months at sea had held compressed. The harbor was noise and movement after the long emptiness of the ocean. Boats calling, goods shifting, a dozen languages in the air at once. For people who had come from the relative quiet of a Highland glen or an Ulster farm, the landing port was a collision with a world they had not imagined at the exact scale at which it existed. Officials recorded names at the dock. The handwriting was often hurried, the ear not always calibrated for Gaelic or Ulster Scots vowels. A Macniacal became a Nicol, an Alastair became an Alexander or simply Alec. The names that survived on the American side were sometimes approximations of the names that had boarded the ship. This is worth knowing if you are tracing family records. Some families had contacts waiting. A letter written a year earlier had described the street, the name of the merchant to find, the congregation to look for. Those families moved through the dockside confusion with something like a plan. Others had none of this and had to build orientation from nothing. The port cities held the newcomers briefly. Provisions were needed. Money had to be stretched. Those who had arrived under indenture were assigned to their employers and taken elsewhere. Free settlers rested for a few days and then faced the question that everyone had been carrying since they left home. Now what? For the Highlanders in particular, the city was not the destination. They were farming people. They knew land. What they needed was ground they could work, not cobblestones and warehouse fronts. The agents who arranged land grants in the interior were busy people in the decades of the Great Migrations. Inland they went, by road, by river, by the tracks that connected communities in ways that would eventually become proper roads. The Scots-Irish who had come before them had already pushed the frontier south and west. There was space still, but it was not close. The walk was long. The Great Wagon Road received them as it had received others, a worn track through a country that was still, in most of its parts, something other than cleared farmland. The trees pressed in from both sides. Strange birdsong, different insects, the weight of a landscape that had not been named by anyone in their family in any language they knew. The land they were entering was not uninhabited. It had not been waiting empty for European settlers to arrive and give it meaning. The Cherokee held the mountains south. The Shawnee and the Lenape held territory further north. These nations had their own histories, their own relationships with the land, their own names for every ridge and valley. What followed between European settlers and indigenous nations was complicated, and much of it was wrong, and the record shows it plainly. Land was taken by treaty and by force. Communities that had lived in these mountains for centuries were displaced in ways that echo the clearances the Scots had fled. though the scale and the violence were their own particular chapter. Honest history does not look away from this. The Scots-Irish settlers who moved into Cherokee country were not abstractions. They were specific people, some of whom traded fairly and built peaceful relationships with their neighbors, and others of whom did not. The record holds both. The land held more. Many families found their place in the valley bottoms, where the soil was deep and the creek gave water and the ridges gave shelter from the worst of the winter. The cabin went up. The trees came down, one at a time, with the kind of labor that redefines what the word work means. The first harvest was the proof. If the ground yielded, you stayed. If it did not, you moved and tried again. Many families moved 2 and 3 times before they found the place that held. Their names followed them, stamped into the land grants and county records of each place they tried. The communities they built were not isolated. Neighbors found each other quickly. The first gathering for worship might be in a clearing or in someone's cabin, with 20 people sitting on logs in the open air and a minister standing at a stump. The congregation preceded the building. The building came when there was time and timber. The Gaelic faded first in most families. English was the language of commerce and politics and the wider world. Gaelic survived in songs and in the speech of the oldest generation, and in the cadences that shaped how families used English even after the old tongue was gone. The accent carried long after the vocabulary did. Letters went back to Scotland when they could be sent. Accounts of the crossing, descriptions of the land, requests for news of people left behind. Some of those letters survive in Scottish archives. They are precise about practical things, the soil quality, the distances, the cost of provisions, and brief about emotion in the Scottish way. A letter written from a North Carolina cabin to a cousin in Sutherland in the 1770s might take 6 months to arrive and another 6 for a reply to return. A year for a conversation. People wrote knowing that by the time the reply came, the circumstances described in the original letter would already be changed. They wrote anyway. This is how the connection was maintained. Not easily, not quickly, not with any guarantee that the letter would arrive at all, but with the understanding that the thread mattered, that knowing someone had read your words across that much water was worth the effort of writing and the uncertainty of sending. The children born in those cabins grew up American in the sense that they knew no other landscape. But they grew up Scottish too, in the sense that the stories they heard in the evenings, the songs their parents sang, the way their families organized themselves, all of it came from somewhere else. They held both. In the evening, when the work was done and the light was failing, the mountains outside the cabin window caught the last of the sun on their ridges. The mist came down the way mist does on hills. The world narrowed to what was close and warm. It was not Scotland, but it recognized something Scotland had taught these people to notice. 2 dusks falling at the same moment across an ocean. In a Highland glen, peat smoke rising from the chimney of a low stone house. A burn running somewhere below in the gathering dark. A family inside, making do, making less do than it should. and on the other side of that same water, an Appalachian hollow settling into evening. A cabin in the trees, wood smoke rising thin and straight in still air. The last light sitting on a ridge that looks, in this light, like it could be any ridge anywhere that hills know what evening means. A child watching it from the doorway before being called inside. Two dusks, one sky. You are between them, as you have always been, listening to this story. The same stars will appear above both valleys tonight, as they have appeared above them every night since the first people came to either place and looked up and understood that the sky connects what the land divides. Tomorrow night, the frontier, the communities these families built, the music they kept, the words they preserved in the mountains, the long echo of Scotland in the hills of America, all of that is waiting. But tonight, the crossing is done. The ships are behind them. The land is real beneath their feet. Let that be enough. The fire is low. The children are asleep. The mountains are exactly where they have always been, patient and unhurried, holding the darkness the way old things hold what they know. You do not need to go anywhere. You are already here, between the glen and the hollow, exactly where the story lives. This has been Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland for anyone who carries a piece of it. Part 2 continues tomorrow night. Good night. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.